August 1944. The gray Atlantic heaved beneath the steel belly of a Liberty ship, its decks crowded with women who had not imagined their war would end this way. They were German auxiliaries, clerks, typists, nurses, radio operators, once stationed in the orbit of the Wehrmacht, swept up when Allied forces collapsed German positions in Normandy and Italy. Now they stood shoulder to shoulder, their uniforms stripped of insignia, their eyes searching the endless horizon with dread. Salt spray stung their faces, the smell of fuel oil and rust mingling with seasickness. A voyage to America had not been in any of their plans. They had been raised on a diet of propaganda that painted America as a land of cruelty, a place where prisoners would be starved or beaten, worked to death in anonymous camps. The Reich's radio insisted that only by standing firm could Germany avoid the humiliation of foreign captivity. Yet the Reich had fallen silent for them, and here they were, adrift between continents. Many clutched bundles of letters from home, now water-stained and creased, the handwriting of mothers and sisters describing shortages, bombings, and the slow hollowing of German cities. Food had vanished from tables. Bread was dark and coarse, stretched with fillers that tasted like sawdust. Butter was a dream. Even potatoes had become rare. Hunger was not an abstraction. It gnawed daily. On the ship, rations were basic but solid. Stew with chunks of beef, coffee black and bitter, bread that was white and strangely soft. Some of the women could not bring themselves to eat at first, convinced it was a trick. But hunger and the steady rocking of the vessel wore down suspicion. They ate quietly, secretly admitting to one another that even this voyage provided more meat than their families might see in a month. The irony cut deep. Night brought silence, broken only by the groan of steel and the crash of waves. The women slept in narrow bunks, dreaming uneasy dreams. One young radio operator, scarcely 20, confessed in whispers that she feared never seeing her younger brother again. Another clutched a small photograph of her parents' farmhouse near Bremen, now reduced to rubble. In those moments, the masks of ideology fell away. They were not soldiers of the Reich, but daughters. Sisters, mothers suddenly adrift in a foreign sea. The guards, mostly young Americans scarcely older than the women, watched with a mixture of indifference and curiosity. They were not cruel. In fact, their discipline and order puzzled the prisoners. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the water in fire, an American sergeant pointed toward the western sky and told them, in halting German, that by tomorrow they would glimpse New York Harbor. The women stiffened. They had heard stories of its towers scraping the heavens, of lights that never dimmed, of a city that never ran out of bread. To them, half-starved and weary, such tales felt closer to myth than truth. The voyage itself became a strange threshold. Every mile pulled them further from the world they knew. The bombed-out train stations, the endless queues for food, the ration cards that bought less each week. Here on the open Atlantic, they had no bearings. The sea stretched without end, and with it came the creeping realization that Germany was shrinking behind them, its promises unraveling. America loomed ahead, unknown, vast, terrifying in its abundance. At dawn on the seventh day, fog lifted to reveal the silhouette of the Statue of Liberty. The ship slowed, whistles sounding across the harbor. The women pressed against the rails, stunned into silence. It was not the statue itself that undid them, though its raised torch seemed impossibly tall, but the world that surrounded it. Barges piled with cargo moved swiftly across the water. Trains clattered along the shoreline. Warehouses and cranes spoke of endless supplies, endless motion. And then the city, New York, rising like a wall of glass and stone, intact, untouched by bombers shimmering in morning light. Some of the prisoners wept openly, not for joy but for the unbearable contrast. While their families scrounged among ruins, here was a metropolis untouched, alive, overflowing. They had believed, as propaganda told them, that America was weak, decadent, stretched thin by war. Yet here it was, glittering and whole, its skyline a blade of truth that cut through every illusion they had carried across the sea. As the Liberty ship docked, the air filled with the scent of roasting coffee drifting from a nearby warehouse, mingling with the sharper tang of fresh bread from a bakery just beyond the pier. For women whose last meals in Germany had been boiled turnips and ersatz margarine, The aroma alone felt like mockery. Hunger sharpened the contrast, but so did pride. To be fed by the enemy, to see abundance in enemy hands, was a humiliation none had prepared for. They filed down the gangplank, flanked by guards, their boots clattering against wood. Some stumbled, weakened by seasickness and anxiety. On the pier, Red Cross workers and military officials checked lists, their pens scratching across paper as names were called. Trucks waited to carry them inland, away from the harbor, into the belly of America. Yet many of the women could not take their eyes from the city skyline. Even in captivity, they were witnessing a truth larger than chains, that America had food, steel, fuel, everything in quantities unimaginable. The Reich, which had promised them glory, had given them only hunger. Among them stood a young typist from Hamburg. She pressed a hand against her stomach, not from pain but from memory, remembering her last meal in Germany, a thin slice of rye bread, a smear of beet jam, and a half cup of chicory coffee. She thought of her mother, gaunt and tired, sending her off with that ration. And here, as trucks rumbled and guards barked orders, the smell of real coffee and real bread floated thick in the air. Her throat tightened. She knew she would never forget that smell. As the convoy pulled away from the harbor, past rows of warehouses bursting with crates, she leaned against the truck's wooden slats and whispered to the woman beside her, "If this is war for them, what hope was there for us?" The words carried more weight than she realized. Around her, others nodded, silent acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. Captivity was no longer just a personal fate. It was a window into a truth their homeland had hidden from them. The truck jolted, and with it came the realization that this was only the beginning. They did not yet know where they were being taken, what their daily life would be, or how they would be fed. But one thing was certain. America had already begun to dismantle their illusions, not with bombs or bullets, but with the simple abundance of everyday life. And soon, in the quiet of a camp mess hall far from the harbor, they would encounter something so ordinary to Americans, yet so unthinkably rich to them, that it would become a memory etched forever, the taste of what the guards laughingly called the Liberty Steak. The trucks rolled westward, leaving behind the towers of New York, carrying their cargo of silence. The German women sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, their eyes wide at the landscape flashing past. They had expected ruins, shortages, perhaps empty roads haunted by rationing, the way Germany looked now. Instead, they saw fields heavy with corn, towns untouched by bombs, children running with ice cream cones in their hands. Each mile deepened the same contradiction. The war that had emptied their homeland had left America overflowing. After 2 days of travel, the convoy reached its destination. Barbed wire stretched across the horizon, tall watchtowers rising at intervals. Guards with rifles stood alert, though their faces carried none of the cruelty the women had feared. A painted sign at the entrance read simply, "Prisoner of War Camp." The letters were stark, yet the grounds within seemed startlingly ordinary. Neatly aligned barracks, a flagpole, a mess hall, even a soccer field etched into the dirt. The strangeness was not the wire or the guards, but how clean everything was. The women were processed in silence, each name ticked off against lists by Red Cross observers who hovered with clipboards. Blankets, utensils, and clothing were handed out, all practical, all clean. A nurse with hollow cheeks from Hamburg looked at the wool blanket in her hands and whispered, "It smells of soap." Her tone carried awe, not sarcasm. Soap had become rarer than gold at home, and here it was woven into fabric. The first night in the barracks, hunger gnawed at them out of habit more than need. They had been conditioned by years of scarcity, by measuring each crumb, each spoonful. When the dinner bell rang, they walked in suspicion toward the mess hall, expecting perhaps another thin broth or black bread as dark as coal. Instead, the hall filled with the scent of roasting meat, onions sizzling in pans, coffee steaming from metal urns. The sound of trays clattering, of American cooks calling out orders, set nerves on edge. It was too loud, too abundant. Plates were filled with thick slices of meatloaf, mashed potatoes drowned in gravy, buttered beans, and bread so white it gleamed. Some of the women stood motionless, staring down at food that looked like feast day portions. They hesitated to touch it, uncertain if it was a test, But hunger prevailed. Forks cut into warm beef, steam rising, and for the first time in years they ate without counting bites. A radio operator from Bremen began to cry quietly over her plate. Another woman muttered, half in disbelief, half in shame, "My family is starving." The words sank into the air like stones. Days settled into rhythm. Roll call at dawn, work assignments during daylight hours, sewing uniforms, tending camp gardens, or repairing roads under guard supervision. Even work seemed laced with contradiction. They were prisoners, yet their labor was compensated with chits redeemable at a camp canteen where they could buy cigarettes, soap, or chocolate. To women accustomed to bartering for a crust of bread, this small economy inside barbed wire felt surreal. The guards were young and often clumsy in their German, yet their treatment lacked the venom expected from enemies. One sergeant, overhearing women whispering about their fear of starvation, laughed and told them, "Don't worry, here you'll get fat." The phrase, meant as reassurance, struck like a blow of irony. Fatness had disappeared from German life years ago. Bones jutted where flesh once was. The idea of prisoners gaining weight was almost obscene, yet it was true. Their bodies began to fill again. Cheeks lost their hollows. Hunger's grip loosened, though guilt remained. At night, in bunks lined with clean sheets, conversations turned inward. Some admitted that captivity was not the hell they expected. Others argued in whispers, insisting that kindness was only a mask, a trick to soften them, that America's abundance was staged. Yet as days passed, the evidence became undeniable. The camp kitchen served eggs at breakfast, sometimes bacon, sometimes fruit. Letters home described empty shelves and ration cards exchanged for shadows. Here, in enemy hands, plates overflowed. The central conflict was no longer simply captivity. It was the unbearable contrast between what they had been taught to believe and what they now saw. Propaganda had promised that America was weak, decadent, on the brink of collapse. Yet the mess hall told another story. America was so strong it could feed its prisoners better than Germany could feed its children. That truth gnawed deeper than barbed wire ever could. Some of the women began to notice details they had once overlooked. The guards' boots were polished, their uniforms fresh, their weapons maintained without rust. In Germany, shortages had worn even soldiers down to patches and scraps. Here everything seemed new, orderly, and plentiful. In the gardens outside the barracks, tomato vines climbed freely, their fruit left unguarded. To those who had seen people shot for stealing potatoes at home, the sight of ripe food unclaimed was a revelation. The irony grew heavier when they learned of American rationing. Civilians here too used coupons, but the limits seemed vast compared to German reality. A week's meat ration in the U.S. could outweigh what a German family might see in a month. And yet, even under rationing, prisoners ate as well as soldiers. To the women, this was not just sustenance. It was a daily reminder of defeat. One evening, in the glow of lanterns, a young typist from Munich whispered to her bunkmate, "If this is captivity, what is freedom?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered, unsettling. It hinted at something deeper than food, a reevaluation of everything they had believed about the world. And still, there was humor, though it carried sharp edges. The American guards sometimes teased, offering what they called Liberty steak instead of beef cuts. It was nothing more than a hamburger patty on bread topped with pickles and onions. To Americans, it was the food of soldiers and workers, a ration-friendly substitute for steak. But to the women, the sight of that thick patty, steaming and juicy, bordered on unimaginable luxury. They whispered about it for days afterward, as though speaking of a dream. The nickname itself carried irony. Liberty steak was meant to disguise the word hamburger, which sounded too German for wartime comfort. Yet here were Germans, real Germans, staring at the dish with awe, their hunger and disbelief mirrored in each bite. To them, the Liberty steak became more than food. It was a symbol of the vast chasm between what they had lost and what America seemed to have in endless supply. The mess hall fell quiet when those burgers appeared. For the first time, women bent forward, inhaling the scent of grilled meat and warm bread. For a moment, no one moved, as though the meal might vanish if touched. Then forks clinked, and bites were taken, and silence gave way to murmurs of astonishment. Some laughed bitterly, others cried. A few pushed plates away, unable to reconcile the taste with the image of starving families across the ocean. That night, long after lights out, voices whispered through the barracks, low and heavy with guilt. One woman said she could still taste the fat on her tongue, even as she pictured her children in bombed Hamburg searching for scraps. Another admitted she had never tasted such richness, not even before the war. And then came the most haunting remark, spoken by the same young typist who had questioned freedom. If even their prisoners eat like this, then the war was over long before we crossed the sea. The barracks fell into silence. Beyond the wire, the camp lay quiet under starlight, guards pacing in measured steps. Inside, the women turned on narrow bunks, each one wrestling with the same unspoken truth. That captivity was not their greatest torment. It was abundance, an abundance they could neither refuse nor forget, that began to break them from within, and yet they had not tasted everything America had to offer. Soon they would face a meal so ordinary to their captors, so common it was dismissed as nothing special, yet so overwhelming to them that it would brand itself in memory forever. The full taste of what Americans laughingly called the Liberty Steak. The summer sun beat down on the Texas plains, the heat shimmering across the barbed wire of the POW camp. Dust clung to boots and uniforms, but inside the mess hall fans whirred lazily, stirring the heavy air scented with smoke and grilled meat. Word had spread through the barracks that dinner would be different tonight. The guards had hinted at it with a smirk, and even the camp cooks carried a certain pride as they hauled trays from the kitchen. The women filed in, shoulders stiff, trays clutched tight, their eyes scanning for the surprise. Then they saw it, a mound of buns stacked high on metal trays, patties sizzling on the griddle, juices spitting, onions browning in the pan. The smell was intoxicating, unlike anything they had encountered in years. It was rich, savory, heavy with fat, a scent that spoke of excess. The guards, grinning at their own joke, called it Liberty Steak. To them, it was just a hamburger, a wartime substitute for real steak, yet still hearty enough to satisfy. But to the German women, it was almost unthinkable that such food could be ordinary. The line shuffled forward. A cook with rolled sleeves dropped a patty onto each waiting bun, then added pickles, a slice of tomato, and a smear of mustard. Some women stared in disbelief at their plates, hardly daring to touch the creation. For years they had survived on dark bread dense with fillers, on watery soups and thin slices of horse meat when available. Meat had become a luxury, fat a rarity, flavor an echo. And now here was a sandwich thick with beef, its juices soaking into soft bread, its smell rising like an invitation and a taunt all at once. The first bite was hesitant. A typist from Bremen lifted the burger to her lips, her hands trembling. She pressed down gently, feeling the warmth seep into her palms, and then tasted it. The explosion of fat and salt, the crisp bite of pickle, the sweetness of onion. It overwhelmed her senses. She closed her eyes and tears came unbidden. "Mein Gott," she whispered, not in profanity but in awe. Around her, others began to eat, the silence breaking into murmurs, gasps, nervous laughter. For some, the joy of taste was immediate. One young nurse chewed greedily, almost desperately, as though each bite might be taken away. Another laughed bitterly, shaking her head as she swallowed, muttering that her father had died of hunger in Hamburg, while she, his daughter, feasted in captivity. The paradox twisted in every mouthful. The burger was delicious, but it carried shame. Each bite reminded them not only of what they lacked at home, but of the collapse of the illusions they had once carried so fiercely. Across the hall, guards leaned against the walls, watching with folded arms. To them, it was an amusing scene, prisoners marveling at the most ordinary of meals. They joked quietly among themselves, never quite cruel, but always aware of the irony. Liberty Steak had been meant as a patriotic rebranding, a way to make Americans forget the German origins of the word hamburger. Now, the joke cut in another direction. Germans themselves were tasting liberty in a form they had never known. The heat of the day pressed in, and sweat beaded on foreheads, but no one cared. The focus was on the burgers, on the shock of abundance. One woman older than the rest set her sandwich down after only 2 bites. Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "I cannot eat this," she said softly. "My children would give anything for this, and I am here, eating while they starve." She pushed the plate away, her hands trembling. The others watched, torn between empathy and hunger, and then returned to their own meals. Guilt was sharp, but hunger sharper. Later in the barracks, the conversations ran deep into the night. They spoke not only of the taste, but of what it meant. Some confessed they had never before eaten beef in such quantity, not even before the war. Others admitted they could not describe the flavor in letters home, fearing it would break their families' hearts. One young clerk said the burger was proof that Germany could never win. If they can feed this to prisoners, she said, what must they give their soldiers? The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. The Liberty steak became a symbol. For some it was humiliation, the enemy flaunting power not with guns but with food. For others it was comfort, a reminder of a world beyond starvation, a small mercy in captivity. But for all it was unforgettable. The texture of the bun, the slick of fat on the tongue, the crunch of a pickle. It became lodged in memory as firmly as the sound of bombs or the sight of burning cities. Days passed, but the burger remained a topic of conversation. Some spoke of it with longing, others with anger, still others with disbelief. The camp routines continued, roll call, work, letters home. But beneath it all ran the quiet hum of realization. America's strength was not only in its armies, not only in its planes or tanks, but in its capacity to feed, to produce, to offer abundance even to its enemies. One evening, as dusk fell and cicadas shrilled in the heat, the women sat outside their barracks, the wire of the camp fence casting long shadows across the dirt. The same typist from Bremen who had first whispered in awe looked at the sky, painted orange with sunset, and said, "If liberty has a taste, it is this." Not speeches, not parades, just this. Her words lingered, drawing nods and stares into the distance. The phrase carried irony, sorrow, and something like hope, though no one dared name it. The guards called lights out, and the camp fell into quiet. But inside, on narrow bunks, the women turned the taste over in their minds again and again. It was not just the burger itself, but what it revealed. Germany had promised them strength, sacrifice, destiny. Yet here they were, prisoners, tasting more in a single meal than their families might see in weeks. The taste of the Liberty steak was a taste of defeat, of humiliation, but also of a world they had never imagined could exist. And still, they did not know that this was only the beginning. Beyond the barbed wire, America's abundance stretched further, deeper into meals and moments yet to come. Soon they would face a truth more unsettling than hunger or captivity, that the enemy's ordinary life was richer than anything their homeland had fought for, and that this realization would linger long after the war ended. The taste of the Liberty steak lingered long after the last crumbs had vanished from tin plates. Days turned into weeks, yet the memory of that simple hamburger shadowed every meal that followed. It was no longer just food. It had become a symbol, a touchstone for conversations whispered in bunks, murmured over laundry lines, carried in letters home where details had to be hidden between safer words. The women could not write hamburger to their families without risk of censorship, so they described it in codes and evasions. A patty of beef more than I have ever seen, wrapped in bread softer than clouds. To their families in Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, such words must have read like fantasy, the irony cut deepest in letters returned. Mothers wrote of queuing for hours only to receive a handful of turnips. Sisters described crumbling bread loaves dark as coal, divided carefully among children who cried for more. One woman received news that her father had collapsed while chopping firewood, weakened by hunger. She held the letter in her hands even as the mess hall bell rang to announce another dinner of meat and potatoes. The contradiction was unbearable. She wept into her food, torn between gratitude and shame. Within the camp, life settled into rhythm, but the central conflict had shifted. It was no longer merely captivity, but the awareness of two worlds colliding, one of scarcity, one of abundance. The guards joked easily, their belts notched loose from steady meals. They seemed oblivious to the revelation their food carried. To them, hamburgers were a working man's lunch, Liberty steaks a compromise during rationing. To the prisoners, they were evidence that America had already won, long before tanks crossed Europe. Victory was measured not just in battles but in calories. Conversations deepened as the women began to reflect aloud. "I used to think America was lazy," said a young nurse one evening, as the lanterns burned low in the barracks. "But if this is laziness, then we were starving for nothing." Another shook her head. "We were lied to," she whispered. The words were dangerous, yet no guard leaned close enough to hear. A silence followed, thick with recognition. The Reich had promised strength, yet it had sent them into hunger and ruin, while their enemy offered abundance even behind barbed wire. One afternoon, the camp received newspapers, dated weeks late but still intact. An American guard handed them over with a shrug, indifferent. The women crowded around, reading headlines of Allied advances, of bombed German cities, of a war tilting toward its conclusion. Photographs showed GIs smiling with mugs of coffee, children on American streets eating candy bars. A typist from Munich stared longest at one photograph of a family picnic, a table groaning with fried chicken, bread, and pies. She touched the page as though it might dissolve, then folded it carefully to keep under her mattress. She did not know if her family in Munich had even a crust of bread left. Even work assignments became tinged with reflection. Sewing uniforms, repairing fences, harvesting vegetables from camp gardens. All of it reminded them of the labor that once went into survival back home. Here, the garden's tomatoes grew plump and unguarded, left to ripen on vines without fear of theft. In Germany, a single potato stolen from a farmer's field might cost a life. The contrast cut sharper than any wire fence. And yet, amid shame and astonishment, there were sparks of something else. Some of the women began to feel a reluctant gratitude. Captivity was not cruelty. It was safety from bombs. It was food in the stomach. It was letters delivered with regularity. The Liberty stake had been a shock, but it also opened a door to a possibility none had imagined. That life could be different. That nations might live not on ration cards and slogans, but on quiet, ordinary abundance. Still, guilt coiled in every thought. At night, dreams of family returned. Children crying for bread, husbands gaunt with hunger, mothers queuing in bombed streets. The prisoners woke to eggs, coffee, and meat. Some pushed food away, unable to eat. Others forced themselves to swallow, knowing survival demanded it. The conflict gnawed at them. To live in abundance while their homeland starved was its own form of torment. One evening, as cicadas hummed and the air thickened with Texas heat, a young woman named Elsa, once a typist in Hamburg, sat outside the barracks with several others. The sunset bled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. She broke the silence. "Do you realize," she said, "that what we call luxury they call ordinary? What we dream about is what they throw to their dogs." Her words carried no malice, only astonishment. The women nodded slowly, their faces lit by the dying sun. That realization grew heavier with each passing week. They began to understand that food was more than sustenance. It was power, politics, proof of a nation's strength. The Liberty stake, once a joke, had become a revelation. In every bite was America's industrial might, its vast fields, its unbroken supply lines. In every bite was Germany's failure. Yet the most haunting shift was internal. Some of the women began to imagine futures beyond the war. Futures not in ruins, but in kitchens filled with food. In families not haunted by hunger. They did not yet dare speak such hopes aloud. But the taste of that burger had planted something in them, something that would not fade. The camp itself became a strange mirror. Guards laughed over their own meals. Prisoners whispered over theirs. Letters arrived with news of devastation. Yet here, under barbed wire, life was steady, predictable, nourished. The contradiction was inescapable. To eat was to live. But to live well here was to confront the deepest betrayal, that they had fought for a homeland that could not provide what their captors offered freely. One night, as thunder rolled over the plains and rain hammered the tin roofs, Elsa lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, but in her mouth she still tasted beef and onion, soft bread, the fat that had melted against her tongue. She thought of her mother's last letter, describing a dinner of boiled nettles. She thought of her younger brother, thin as a shadow, scavenging ruins for scraps. And she whispered into the dark, "I will never forgive them for this. Not for the bombs, not for the barbed wire, but for feeding me while my family starves." Her words struck the silence like lightning. The other women shifted in their bunks, restless, their own thoughts mirroring hers. For in the end, captivity was not measured by fences or guards, but by the knowledge that the enemy's commonest meal had revealed a truth too vast to ignore. And soon, that truth would extend beyond the camp fence, beyond the war itself. For when these women returned to Germany, they would carry with them not only stories of defeat, but the memory of abundance. A memory that would shape how they saw both nations forever.